The thought I didn't see when he put a strange substance in my glass of water. When he got distracted, I switched the glasses. Everyone was...
Drink up, Frank. You look pale. To Eleanor.
Maybe it's time you step aside.
I'm not stepping aside. I'm stepping forward.
You poisoned him! Admit it! I switched the glasses.
I chose to live.
Enough. Statements, now.
Truth made the room the size it really was.
You made me look small in there.
They thought I'd step aside. I stepped forward. Justice doesn't whisper. It knocks.
My daughter's husband thought he was clever. A smile, a glass of water, and a deadly plan to erase me from my $12.5 million estate. My own blood turned against me, blinded by greed. But what he didn't know was that my late wife had left behind one letter, a letter so powerful it destroyed every lie. You won't believe what I did next. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and tell us where you're listening from in the comments. I sat alone in the living room that evening, the old grandfather clock ticking away in the corner, every chime echoing like a reminder of how much time I had given to my family. My hands rested on the worn arms of the chair I had bought with my first bonus check back in the 70s, when all I thought about was building a future for my wife and daughter. I remembered writing that first check for Linda's college tuition, $60,000 in 1 year, and thinking it was the best investment I could ever make. I wanted her to have choices I never had. Later, when she married Richard, I surprised them with a car, a $25,000 sedan that I paid for in cash. I can still see the smile on her face that day. Then there was the $150,000 I pulled from my savings to help them buy their first home. I told myself, this is what fathers do. This is what love looks like. Tonight, sitting here alone, I couldn't help but ask, if all that love and sacrifice only led to betrayal, what was the point of it all? I looked around the room at the house that had stood with me through decades of storms. This house alone was worth $750,000 now. The insurance policies, the investments, the pension I had built up, together they added up to more than $12.5 million. It should have been a safety net for Linda, a way to honor the life Eleanor and I had built together. Instead, it had become a target, a number they whispered about behind closed doors. I saw the pictures on the mantel, our wedding portrait, the family photo we took at Christmas when Linda was 10, and I felt the sting of what was being threatened. It wasn't just the money, though the money was enough to tempt the darkest part of a person's soul. It was my family, my blood, my daughter. To have all of it at risk, not from strangers, but from the very people I loved the most. That was the wound I could not easily describe. At first, when I realized what they were planning, I was broken. I had already buried Eleanor, the woman who held my hand through every high and low. Now I had to face the truth that my daughter and her husband were plotting against me. The shock was heavy, like someone had taken a hammer to my chest. But sitting in this quiet room, in the house Eleanor had filled with laughter, I felt a shift. Pain gave way to something sharper. I realized I could not sit here and let them take everything. I could hear myself whisper, almost as if speaking to Eleanor. If you were here, what would you tell me to do? The silence was deep, but in that silence, I heard my own answer. I could not be weak. Not anymore. They might think they had the upper hand, but they were wrong. I stood up and walked across the creaking hardwood floors I had installed myself back when Eleanor was pregnant with Linda. Each plank carried a memory, each nail hammered in with hope for a future. The photographs on the wall seemed to look back at me. Eleanor's smile, framed in a black and white print, rested above the fireplace. The betrayal of my daughter felt like a knife to the heart, sharper than any blade. I ran my fingers along the edge of that photo frame and whispered, "Linda, how could you do this to me?" The weight of the question filled the room. I imagined Eleanor sitting beside me, her hand on mine, telling me that strength was the only way forward. The longer I sat there, the more I felt the anger boiling up inside me. It wasn't the kind of rage that makes you reckless. It was colder, heavier, the kind that sharpens your mind instead of clouding it. I thought about the years I worked overtime, the long nights I spent away from home just so Linda would never have to struggle. I thought about every check I wrote, every sacrifice I made, and I realized something. They saw me as weak. They saw me as an old man whose time was almost up. But they were wrong. I was still here. I was still breathing. And I still had choices. My eyes fell on the drawer of the old cabinet against the wall. Dust had gathered around the brass handle, and I had not opened it in years. Slowly, I pulled it open and felt the weight of the files inside. There it was, the folder with our life insurance policy, the official deeds, and the will Eleanor and I had updated years ago. My heart beat faster as I opened the papers, the scent of old paper and ink filling my nose. I held the documents in my hands, and a spark lit inside me. Maybe I can still turn this around, I muttered to myself. The thought was like a candle in the dark, small but steady. The room was quiet except for the sound of the clock. The late afternoon light came in through the curtains, casting long shadows across the floor. Dust floated in the air like tiny sparks, catching the sunlight. I sat there with the papers on my lap, the house around me, both a comfort and a reminder of what was at stake. Every corner of this room held a memory. The sofa where Eleanor and I sat after dinner, the rug Linda used to sprawl out on with her crayons, the lamp I fixed a dozen times instead of throwing away. It all spoke to me, reminding me of what I stood to lose if I did nothing. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with resolve. I leaned back in my chair and let out a long breath. The betrayal still hurts. It would always hurt. But I wasn't powerless. I still had the strength to fight, and I still had something worth fighting for. I could almost hear Eleanor's voice in the air around me, calm and steady. "Don't let them take it, Frank. Don't let them take what we built." I nodded slowly, clutching the papers tighter. I knew then that the next chapter of this story wouldn't be about me sitting in silence, waiting for them to strip me of everything. No, the next chapter would be about me standing up, facing them, and proving that even at 65, I was not done yet. The light outside faded into gold, then into the soft shadows of evening. The photographs on the wall glowed in the dim light, Eleanor's eyes following me as if to say she believed in me still. I rose from the chair, stronger than when I sat down. With the folder of documents in my hands, I felt armed in a way I hadn't in years. I whispered one last time into the quiet, "This isn't over. Not yet." And in that moment, I knew I was ready for whatever was coming in Chapter 3. If you're still watching and find this story interesting, please comment 1 below to let me know you're here with me. I woke before dawn and watched the gray light crawl across the ceiling, the quiet house breathing the way old houses do. The clock in the hallway clicked once every second. I counted them for a while. Then I stopped counting and sat up. Enough thinking, enough remembering. It was time to act. I poured myself coffee, black and strong, and spread papers across the kitchen table like a man laying out a map. Insurance statements, account numbers, the deed, the will. I ran my finger down the balances, line by line, until the fear in my chest settled into something colder and leaner. Resolve. I picked up the phone. "Coleman," I said when my lawyer answered. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. "It's Frank. I need you to freeze anything with my name on it. Today. No transfers, no withdrawals, no signatures accepted unless they come from me in person. Start with the savings account, $300,000, then the brokerage, then the annuities. I want locks on the doors before anyone thinks to jiggle the handle." He was quiet for a second, then cleared his throat. "Understood, Frank. Are you safe?" "I'm breathing," I said, "and I'm done being naive." He promised to file the instructions immediately. He told me which forms would need my signature in person, which banks would accept emergency flags by email from his office, and which managers he trusted. We reviewed names, extensions, and the wording of the hold requests. Precise language. No room for interpretation. When he finished, I repeated the numbers back to him from memory, one by one, like a man confirming coordinates before a storm hits. He said he would call me the moment the notices were confirmed. I hung up and felt the tiniest click of power return to my hands. Next, I called the bank. I recognized the young man's voice on the line. He had helped me set up online access years ago. "Good morning, this is Franklin," I said. "I'm calling to put a hold on a savings account, ending in 5621, $300,000, no activity without my physical presence. And I do mean none." I kept my tone even, calm. The words did the work. He asked for verification, and I answered each question slowly, letting the pauses land. Mother's maiden name. Last deposit. Address on file. When he finished his checklist, he lowered his voice a little, like a person does when they're about to say something they shouldn't. "We did receive a balance inquiry yesterday from a party listed as a family financial manager," he said. "A Richard Bradley." I looked at the window over the sink. Rain traced thin lines down the glass. "There is no manager," I said. "That's my son-in-law. If he calls again, you don't know him. If he shows up, you don't know him. If he brings a smiling army behind him, you don't know any of them. Lock it down." "Yes, sir. I'll add the note personally." His voice firmed up. "Consider it done." I thanked him, then called the branch manager and repeated everything. I pictured the notes popping up on their screen in bold type. "Do not release funds. Do not accept third-party requests." Only after the second confirmation email landed in my inbox did the tightness in my shoulders loosen a notch. Not much. A notch. The house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the drone of the heater kicking on. I set the phone down and looked around the kitchen. I had built the maple shelves with my own hands. Eleanor had picked the paint. A soft off-white, she said, looked like cream in morning light. I could hear her laugh if I closed my eyes. I could hear the old radio on the counter playing Sinatra while we danced barefoot and burned the pancakes. I swallowed hard and put a hand on the countertop to steady myself. "If you were here, Ellie," I whispered, "you'd say, keep your head. You'd say, write it down and follow the steps." So I wrote it down. Step 1, lock the money. Step 2, call the insurance company and request a fraud alert. Step 3, meet Coleman before noon to deliver signatures. Step 4, keep my voice calm when I call Linda. I saved that call for last, not because I was afraid, because I needed to be the one in control when I spoke. I needed my words to be shorter than my breath. I found her name in my favorites and stared at it for a long second, remembering the day I helped her pick a bike from the hardware store, purple with silver stripes, how she'd looked back at me and waved from the sidewalk like she owned the sun. I pressed call. "Dad," she said, a little too fast, a little too bright. "Everything okay?" "Everything's fine," I said. "I wanted you to know I met with Coleman. We're reviewing the accounts. All of them. The house, too. We're keeping things simple for now." There was a pause, and I heard the rustle of fabric near the phone, like she was covering the mouthpiece to whisper to someone. Then her voice changed. Colder. Controlled. "Dad, maybe it's time you step aside," she said. "Richard and I can handle the practical things. You've been through a lot." I had rehearsed a dozen replies, but in that moment I chose one sentence. "I'm not stepping aside," I said. I kept my tone even, my words slow. "I am stepping forward." Another rustle. Then a sigh that wasn't quite a sigh. "You know we only want what's best for you." "I know what you want," I said, and I let the quiet sit between us like a table no one could cross. "We'll talk at Mr. Coleman's office at 10. "We've got a busy morning," she said. "Richard has meetings." 10, I repeated. "You asked me to be practical. I'm being practical." I ended the call before her next word landed. I had given her enough of my seconds for one morning. When I arrived at the bank to sign the physical holds, the branch lobby smelled like lemon polish and new carpet. The manager, a woman about my age with a tidy bun and sharp eyes, met me at her desk. She printed the forms and slid them across to me, one at a time, walking me through the language. Temporary hold. No third-party access. Verification in person required. I initialed each paragraph and signed at the bottom, my pen scratching a firm, steady line. When we finished, she put the stack into a folder and squared it with the edge of the desk, precise as a surgeon. "For what it's worth," she said, "you're doing the right thing." "I waited too long to do the right thing," I said, "but I'm doing it now." From there, I drove to Coleman's office. The sky had cleared, and winter sun lay flat across the windshield, bright but cold. The conference room always looked the same: heavy chairs, a long table, a framed print of a lighthouse looking out over a gray sea. Coleman stood when I walked in and shook my hand with both of his, the way people do when they want you to feel steady. He reviewed the emails he had sent, the responses received, the notes from the bank manager, and the names of the judges who tended to sign emergency protective orders when needed. We worked like two men repairing a roof in the rain, fast, careful, no wasted motion. At 10:15, Linda and Richard slid into their seats across from me. Linda wore a sweater I had bought her last Christmas. Richard wore a suit a shade too shiny for a daytime meeting. He smiled the way a salesman smiles, as if he had just remembered your name from a commercial. "Frank," he said, "how are you holding up?" "I'm present," I said. I didn't offer more. Coleman began with a checklist, authenticating signatures, confirming powers of attorney. He asked Linda if she understood that my estate planning documents could not be altered without my clear consent. She nodded, eyes on the table. Richard leaned back a little and tapped his phone with his thumb, half listening, half somewhere else. I noticed his cufflinks, little silver squares that caught the light like fish scales. I noticed the way he kept glancing toward the small sideboard where a pitcher of water and glasses sat on a tray. Coleman stepped out to retrieve a file. The room felt suddenly too quiet. Richard stood and said, "Let me grab some water for everyone." He used the tone of a man doing a kindness, a tone he had used many times in my home, at my table. I watched him pour. 2 glasses first. Then he reached into his pocket for something small. My heart made a hard, cold turn. The moment stretched long enough for me to see the muscles in his jaw shift. He set a glass in front of me with a soft clink. "Drink up, Frank," he said lightly. "You look a little pale." I lifted the glass. I could see his face over the rim. A shallow smile. Not much, but enough. Behind that smile, the calculation. I remembered Eleanor's words in the letter she had once hinted at, words I could almost hear. "Watch his eyes, Frank." When Coleman's door handle clicked, Richard glanced down at his phone. A small timer glowed on the screen. 5 minutes. My hand moved before my thoughts caught up. I set my glass down and reached for a pen that had rolled near his elbow. As he turned his head toward Coleman's voice, I swapped the glasses, mine for his for mine, one smooth slide, one small spin. The glasses were identical. The water was identical. The moment was not identical. It was different in a way that cracked open the air. "To Eleanor," I said softly, raising the glass I had moved in front of him, as if practicing a toast, as if reminding myself who I was doing this for. He blinked. For a heartbeat, his expression emptied. Then he laughed too quickly. "To Eleanor," he said, picking up the glass now in front of him, his hand a shade less steady than before. He took a swallow. Not much. Enough. Coleman sat, unaware of the storm passing silently over his conference table. He reviewed the next document, outlining the language about residential rights. I nodded at the right places. Richard turned his wrist to check the timer again. Less than 3 minutes. He adjusted his tie. He swallowed. I watched a bead of sweat appear at the edge of his hairline. The room felt warmer. By the time Coleman finished his explanation, Richard's smile had thinned to a line. His pupils looked too large. He set his glass down, missed the coaster, and the rim thudded against the wood. Linda glanced at him. "You okay?" she whispered. "I'm fine," he said, but his voice had flattened. He stood, then sat again. His breath shortened. His hand twitched, then steadied, then twitched again. He reached for his phone, fumbled it, and let it clatter to the table. The timer blinked 0. "Richard?" Coleman said, eyebrows up. Richard's eyes rolled, just once, like a person fighting off sleep in a church pew. He folded forward, caught himself, then slid sideways in the chair, knocking his knee against the edge of the table so hard the pitcher rattled. The sound was sharp in the quiet room. Linda gasped. Coleman was on his feet, calling 911, giving the address in a clipped and firm voice. I sat very still and stared at the water rings on the wood. I imagined Eleanor's hand on my shoulder. I imagined sunlight through a hospital window, the smell of antiseptic and coffee, all those months I spent next to her while the world narrowed to a single breath at a time. I felt nothing like triumph, only a hard relief, hard and heavy. The paramedics came fast. They worked on him with urgent competence, the kind of ritual that looks like choreography. Assess, secure, lift, go. Linda's voice grew high and thin. She asked questions no one answered. She said my name twice like it was a question. I didn't respond. They wheeled Richard out with the oxygen mask fogging in quick bursts. The room deflated when the door shut behind them, like a balloon losing air. At the hospital, fluorescent lights and cold air hit me like a wall. I gave my name at the desk and sat in a chair that felt built for discomfort, the vinyl whispering under my coat every time I shifted. Coleman stood beside me, speaking quietly to someone on the phone, his words moving like stones clicking in a game of checkers. Linda paced, then stopped, then paced again. Every time she stopped, she stared at me, lips pressed, hands twisting. Finally, she walked over and lowered herself into the chair across from me, knees pointed at the door. "My father hated Richard for years," she told the detective when he arrived. Her finger lifted and pointed at me, her voice suddenly steady and cold. "Maybe he snapped. Maybe he poisoned him." The words hit me like a clean punch. I knew they were coming. I still felt them in my ribs. The detective, a tall man with careful eyes, didn't write anything at first. He looked at me as if measuring the weight of my breath. I met his gaze and kept my hands folded in my lap. "Sir?" he said. "I drank nothing from that glass," I said. He handed it to me. I switched it. Call it instinct. Call it self-preservation. Call it what you want. But I did not poison him. Linda shook her head, a slow sweep side to side, like a metronome counting out a tune she had learned from someone else. "He's been bitter since Mom died," she said to the detective. "He's scared to live alone. He's scared to let go." "I'm scared of one thing," I said. "I'm scared of people who smile when they hand you water." My voice surprised me. It was flat as a board, unapologetic. The detective kept watching me. He finally flipped his notebook open and wrote a single line. They took my statement in a small room that smelled like coffee and bleach. Coleman sat with me. He spoke only when necessary. The detective asked about the meeting, about the glasses, about Richard's phone. "There was a timer," I said. 5 minutes. "How do you know it was related?" he asked. "Because I know the look of a man waiting for something to kick in," I said, "and because I'm still here." He didn't smile. He didn't frown. He made a note and thanked me. He said they would test the glassware from Coleman's office, the residue in the pitcher, the rim prints, the works. He said the hospital would run tox screens. He said we should stay in the building until someone told us otherwise. When he left, the room felt too quiet. Coleman exhaled slowly and rubbed his eyes with a thumb and forefinger. "I'm sorry, Frank," he said. "I should have anticipated something." "You anticipated plenty," I said. "And you moved fast. We held the money. That matters." Linda did not sit with me again. She made calls in the hallway, her voice low and hard, the way a person talks when they want to believe something, and no, they shouldn't. I studied the scuff marks on the floor where chairs had scraped paint 100 times. I studied the bulletin board with its smiling volunteers and blood drive posters. I studied my hands. They looked older than they had that morning. Steadier, too. By late afternoon, a nurse told us Richard was stable. She didn't tell us much else. The detective said he would follow up when the lab had something useful. Coleman offered to drive me home. I said I preferred to walk, and he didn't argue. The air outside was sharp with a smell of rain and car exhaust, the kind of evening air that wakes you up and puts you to sleep at the same time. I pulled my coat tighter and headed toward the lot where I'd left my car. Back at the house, the quiet felt different. Not softer, not warmer. Different. I moved through the rooms without turning on lights, letting the last of the day lay shadows over the furniture. In the living room, the framed photos glowed dimly on the mantel. I stopped in front of the wedding portrait and looked into Eleanor's eyes. I had always admired how the photographer caught her looking straight at the lens, calm and open, as if she could see the future and didn't mind it at all. "They think I'm weak," I said into the room. "They think I'm tired. They think they can push me and I'll fall." I waited. The house creaked as the heat kicked on. I felt the word settle. I said it to them again. "They think I'm weak, but they're going to learn." I sat at the dining table and reviewed what had happened, the way you review a chess match after the board is cleared. I listed the moves, the phone calls, the forms, the switch, the accusation. I wrote them down on a yellow pad with a blue pen, and then I drew a line beneath them and wrote a single sentence. "Keep moving." Under that, I wrote one more. "Find what Eleanor left." Something in my memory clicked like a key touching the pins in a lock, a remark she had made in the last weeks, quiet and easy, like an afterthought. "You'll know where to look when you need to." I pictured her closet. I pictured the top shelf where she kept the old quilt we had bought at a church sale, the one with stitching as tight as fine handwriting. I stood up and went down the hall, the floor cool under my socks, the air smelling faintly of cedar from a sachet she'd tucked into a drawer years ago. I pushed aside the boxes and the old garment bag and reached for the quilt. It was heavier than I remembered. When I lifted it down, something slid behind it and tapped the shelf with a soft, dull sound. I moved the quilt to the bed and reached back. My fingers touched the edge of a small fireproof safe, the kind with a keypad and a simple handle. I ran my hand over the top and felt dust, then a clean line where the cover had rested. I pressed my palm flat on the lid and closed my eyes. "I'm here," I whispered. "I'm listening." I carried the safe to the dining room table and set it down on a towel so it wouldn't scratch the wood. I stared at the keypad for a long minute, then tried the obvious dates. Our anniversary, her birthday, Linda's birthday. The first two failed. The third one clicked. The little green light blinked and the handle turned with a soft, stubborn give, like a door used to being closed. I lifted the lid. Inside were documents in a neat stack and a single envelope with my name on it in Eleanor's slow, careful handwriting. I didn't open it, not yet. I let the sight of it slow my breathing, slow my thoughts, slow everything that had been spinning since sunrise. I looked at the top document and saw the title of our life insurance policy in bold, then a copy of the deed, then a sealed addendum with Miss Coleman's office listed as witness. I put my palm on the stack and felt the dry coolness of paper that mattered. I sat down, folded my hands, and let the silence gather. They think I am weak. They think the day belongs to them. They think their timing is perfect and their plan is airtight. But they do not know what is in this safe. They do not know what Eleanor wrote. They do not know how far I will go to guard what we built. I rose, turned off the kitchen light, and looked once more at the envelope with my name. "Hongi to you joy," I said aloud, the words simple and solid in my mouth. But they will learn their mistake. I slid the envelope back into the safe and closed the lid, leaving the lock unlatched for now, like a promise. I picked up the phone to call Coleman and tell him I had found something important, something we would need in the morning. I stopped with my finger over his number and let the thought settle. No, not tonight. Tonight, I would keep this close. I wanted one quiet hour to sit with the knowledge that the next move was mine. The next step belonged to me. In the quiet of that room, with evening pressing gentle hands against the windows and the photographs watching over me like old friends, I made a vow. "They think I've lost," I said, letting each word stand on its own like a small stone laid carefully on a path. "They think the game is over, but it has barely begun." I breathed in. I breathed out. I pressed my palm against the safe and felt its cool, steady weight. Tomorrow I will open the envelope. Tomorrow I will walk into Coleman's office with proof. Tomorrow I will set the rest of the machine in motion. But tonight I allowed myself one simple truth, clear and fierce. I was not stepping aside. I was stepping forward, and I had just placed my hand on the one thing that could change everything. If you're still watching and find this story interesting, please comment too below to let me know you're here with me. Coleman was already standing when I walked into his office that morning, a ring of light pouring across the conference table like a stage cue. He handed me a small brass key without a word. I knew exactly what it was, and my hand tightened around it the way a drowning man grips the rope. "Eleanor's," he said softly. "Top of the closet, back left. I'll wait here." I didn't answer. I just nodded and drove home with the key in my pocket, feeling every bump in the road as if the car were a drum and my heart was keeping time. The house was still, the kind of still that comes after a long storm. I went straight to the bedroom closet, moved the quilt, lifted the fireproof safe onto the bed, and set it down on a folded towel. The keypad blinked, patient and unafraid. I tried Linda's birthday again. The green light flashed. The latch gave with a gentle click, the sound so soft it made my chest ache. I lifted the lid. Careful. Inside were documents in a neat stack and an envelope, thick paper. My name is on it in Eleanor's slow, careful script. The room felt smaller as I slid the envelope free, smaller and somehow brighter, like the sun had moved closer to the window without asking. I sat at the dining table where we had eaten Sunday pancakes for 40 years. I ran my thumb along the edge of the envelope and breathed through the tightness in my throat. "I'm here," I said to the air. "I'm listening." Then I opened it. Her voice arrived in my hands. "To my dearest Frank, if you're reading this, the day has come. I wish it hadn't. I wish we had more time for silly jokes and burnt toast. But if it's you and this letter, then I need you to know what I learned while you were taking care of me." She wrote of phone calls she overheard when the morphine made a soft curtain in the afternoon. Richard's voice. Questions about our policies. Questions about my prognosis. Questions about your daily walks, your heart meds, your routines. She wrote of the investigator she had hired quietly, of gambling markers, of false accounts, of names not his own. Then the line that sat up straight on the page. "If I'm gone, protect yourself. Protect our work." I changed the will. Most of it goes where it will do good. Our community foundation, scholarships for hospice nurses, a fund for seniors who've been swindled. Linda will be fine with the life she's built, but she cannot be the door that money walks through to reach Richard. Not until she sees him for who he is. Forgive me for being blunt. Forgive me for being a mother who is afraid for her child. I trust you to do what is right with a kind heart and a steady hand. I love you. I always will. I set the letter down and pressed my palms to the table. The wood felt cool, honest. I lifted the rest of the documents. The new will was there, signed and notarized, witnessed by Coleman's paralegal and a second witness from the office. The numbers were clear. The house is valued at $750,000. The savings and brokerage accounts, the annuities, the life insurance, together $12.5 million on paper wrapped in legal language that had held up lives like scaffolding for years. The charitable allocations were spelled out in tidy percentages. Linda was not cut off. She had a smaller share, structured with safeguards that would keep Richard's hands out unless he could pass through a hedge of thorns built from common sense. I slid everything back into the safe except the letter and the will. Those went into a manila envelope. I locked the house and drove back to Coleman's office with the envelope on the seat beside me like a sleeping child. The sky was clear and sharp. It looked like a crisp sheet of paper ready for the first line of ink. Coleman took the envelope and read in silence while I sat with my hands folded. I watched his eyes move, left to right, word to word. I watched his jaw tighten when he reached the paragraph about the investigator. When he finished, he exhaled and nodded. "This is a sword and a shield," he said. "We'll file a notice of the revised will immediately. We'll register copies with the court and the bank. We'll inform the foundation. Once it's stamped, it's a matter of record no one can ignore." We had barely started drafting the filings when his assistant knocked and slipped in a message. Coleman read it, then looked up at me with a face that was both calm and alert, the way a pilot looks when a light turns on in the cockpit. "Richard retained counsel," he said. "They've submitted a later will to the probate clerk, dated 2 months after Eleanor's. It leaves everything to Linda outright." The room made a small tilt. Not much, enough to make me reach for the table. "A later will," I said. I could feel my heartbeat in my neck. "Let me guess. The signature looks perfect." Coleman tapped the page. "It looks like Eleanor's hand. The notary is some rent-a-stamp on the other side of the county. The witnesses, one of them is a name that shows up on quick filings for all sorts of questionable documents. The other is a man who lists his address as a P.O. box behind a strip mall." My first response wasn't anger. It was the strangest feeling of recognition. I could see that the afternoon he had brought me a stack of papers while Eleanor slept. Insurance forms, prescription refills, a request for updated signatures from the hospice. I had signed my name 3 times without a second glance because the woman I loved was dying in the next room. My hand clenched into a fist on my knee. I opened it slowly. I said it out loud so there would be no confusion in my own head. "He used our grief as a desk." "We challenge it," Coleman said simply. "We move fast. We put your authenticated will on the record, and we request an injunction blocking action on any competing will until a full hearing. We subpoena the notary who stamped their paper. We depose the witnesses. We ask for handwriting analysis, and we bring in Eleanor's attending nurse and the hospice director to testify about her capacity on the date he claims she signed." I took a breath. It went all the way in and came all the way out. "Do it," I said. He was already moving. He dictated a motion as his assistant typed. He detailed the charitable distributions in the will. He noted the dates of Eleanor's diagnosis and her condition at the time she signed the real document. He cited the standard of proof for a later instrument. He stapled copies, initialed the corners, and handed me a pen to sign at the bottom. "Once we walk this to the clerk," he said, "the clock starts for them, and we get to choose the arena." We took the elevator down together. The courthouse stood 3 blocks away, a square building with sandstone columns and glass doors that reflected slices of winter sky. The probate clerk's office smelled like paper and toner, the air slightly warm from old machines doing steady work. Coleman handed over the filings with the calm of a man placing a bet he had counted. The clerk stamped each page. The sound of the stamp was a satisfying heavy thump, as if the paper itself were being nailed to something sturdy. The date glowed red in the corner. Official. Real. Seen. By the time we stepped back onto the sidewalk, Richard's attorney had filed for an emergency conference to clarify the testator's intent. That was their phrase. Clarify. As if my wife's careful signature had been a smudge. Coleman checked his watch. "Judge at 2, he said. "Plenty of time to get coffee." He looked at me. "You ready?" "I am," I said. "More than I've been in months." We sat in a small cafe across from the courthouse. The coffee tasted like courage, and the paper cup warmed my hands. I thought of Eleanor's letter again. I thought of the line about the foundation for nurses. I thought of Linda as a baby, asleep on my chest on a Sunday afternoon, my shirt damp with her breath. I wondered if she would come to the hearing. I wondered which seat she would choose. At 1:50, we took our places in Department 6. The courtroom was paneled in dark wood that smelled faintly of furniture wax and old arguments. Flags stood in the corners like quiet witnesses. The judge entered. He had kind eyes and a brisk tone. He reviewed the calendar, then called our matter first. Coleman rose. The other side rose. Linda sat behind them, hands clenched in her lap, eyes darting between us. Richard was not there. I did not ask why. I did not need to see his face to know he was near. The other lawyer started fast, as if speed itself might impress the bench. He spoke of Eleanor's love for her daughter. He spoke of a later will more in keeping with family tradition. He slid a paper onto the clerk's desk. The judge thumbed through it and frowned. "Notary's seal is faint," he noted. "And your witness statement is missing a printed address. Counsel?" Coleman stepped forward with the calm of a man spreading a picnic blanket at the exact center of the lawn. "Your Honor, we have filed a prior will executed in my office, properly notarized, witnessed by 2 disinterested individuals, and accompanied by a contemporaneous letter from the testator to her husband explaining her reasoning. We also have sworn statements from her treating physicians as to her mental capacity on that date." The late-filed document offered by opposing counsel bears numerous irregularities. We request a temporary restraining order preventing any transfer or encumbrance of estate assets pending a full evidentiary hearing. We further request an order to preserve evidence, including all digital files, drafts, and communications related to the purported later will. The judge looked at our stack, then at theirs. He adjusted his glasses. He read silently for a moment that felt like the whole afternoon. When he looked up, his face had the shade of a decision forming. "Mr. Coleman," he said, "the letter." Coleman handed up a copy of Eleanor's words. The judge read. I watched the shift in his jaw when he reached the part about protecting Linda from herself. I watched his eyes stop for a heartbeat on the line about the charity for seniors who had been swindled. He folded the pages, then opened them again, then set them down as gently as if they were something that could bruise. "Admitted for purposes of this hearing," he said, "I will allow it as context for the will on file." The other lawyer stood again and tried to reframe. He spoke of last wishes. He spoke of fidelity to a dying mother's desire to provide for her only child. He said the word compassion as if it were a key that would open doors. Then he made a mistake. He offered to cure the defects in their notary acknowledgement later. The judge lifted an eyebrow the way a teacher does when a student hands in a paper with the wrong name on it. "You may not cure a signature," he said dryly. "Either the woman signed with the capacity required, in the presence required, and the formalities required, or she did not. We do not patch wills in the hallway." Linda reached forward and gripped the back of the bench in front of her like a person on a small boat when a bigger boat passes. Her knuckles went white. I looked back at her for a second. It was the first time our eyes had met in that room. She didn't look away. There was anger there. There was fear. There was something else I couldn't name, something that looked like someone waking up in a strange hotel room and not remembering how they arrived. The judge turned to us. "I am granting the temporary restraining order," he said. "No transfers, no encumbrances, no attempts to probate a subsequent instrument without leave of this court. We will set a date for an evidentiary hearing. In the meantime, all parties are ordered to preserve any communications and drafts related to testamentary documents, including electronic files. Counsel, you will coordinate subpoenas to the notary and the witnesses listed in the later filing. I will hear from the hospice nurse and the attending physician as to capacity." The words hit like a bell, clear, solid, official. The other lawyer started to say something, and stopped. He gathered his papers with more noise than necessary, the way a person slams a cupboard that won't close. Linda stood too quickly and had to steady herself with a hand on the bench. Coleman touched my elbow, a small pressure, grounding and real. As we filed out, the hallway hummed with footsteps and low voices. Linda stepped into my path. For a heartbeat, I thought she might reach for me. Instead, she spoke in a voice that sounded like it belonged to someone older than either of us. "This isn't what Mom wanted," she said. Not a question, a warning. I kept my own voice low. "Mom wrote it down," I said. "She made sure we didn't have to guess." "She was sick," Linda snapped. "She wasn't herself." "She chose a day when she was," I said. "Her doctors will say so, her nurse will say so, and her words already did." Her face tightened around the eyes. She looked past me, over my shoulder, toward the elevator where her husband's lawyer stood, pretending not to listen. "You're humiliating me," she whispered. "No," I said. "I'm protecting what your mother and I built. I'm also protecting you, whether you can feel that or not." She shook her head and walked away, her heels tapping out a rhythm that echoed down the corridor. I watched her turn the corner and disappear. The sound of her steps faded. The air felt colder without them. The next morning, Coleman's subpoenas went out. The notary was not happy to receive one. Neither was the witness with the P.O. box. The investigator Eleanor had hired met with Coleman and me in his office and laid a thick file on the table. Phone records, emails, screenshots of a browser history that read like a list of bad ideas. A message from Richard to a man named Vince asking about clean paperwork for family business. Coleman's mouth flattened when he reached that line. "We'll get this into the record," he said, carefully. 2 days later, we reconvened for a brief status hearing. The judge had requested any preliminary evidence probative of authenticity. That was his phrase. Probative. I liked the sound of it. It meant weighty in the right way. Coleman introduced an affidavit from Eleanor's hospice nurse. She described Eleanor's lucidity on the day she signed the valid will. The nurse wrote about the way Eleanor insisted on reading each paragraph herself, then signing slowly and smiling when she was done, a soft smile like a person finally putting something heavy where it belongs. The other side tried to counter with an affidavit from their notary. In it, the notary claimed Eleanor had come to his office, assisted by a family friend, and had appeared coherent. He didn't include the date originally. Coleman pointed this out. The judge asked a single question. "Where is your journal?" The notary hesitated. "Misplaced," he said. The judge did not smile. The courtroom air changed temperature without the thermostat moving an inch. We proceeded to the hearing a week later. On that day, the courtroom was fuller. Word travels fast when a large number is attached to it, and $12.5 million made the benches creak under the weight of strangers' interest. I wore my best suit. I polished my shoes the way my father taught me. Small circles, patient, bring up the shine instead of forcing it. I carried Eleanor's letter in my inside pocket. I did not need to take it out. I needed to know it was close to my heart while I spoke. Coleman called the hospice nurse. She was small and steady, with lines around her eyes that suggested she had spent a lifetime seeing and not flinching. She told the court about Eleanor's last months. She told them about the day Eleanor signed at the law office, how she insisted on taking a break halfway through to sip tea and talk about the scholarship for nurses. She told them Eleanor used the phrase, "for the good we can still do." Her voice didn't waver. She didn't add anything unnecessary. She answered questions from the other side without heat. When she stepped down, I wanted to thank her, but I didn't. I kept my hands folded in my lap and let the weight of gratitude sit quietly beside me. The investigator testified next. She described the pattern she had seen in Richard's finances, the gambling debts, the short-lived LLCs, the names that weren't his. She kept her tone clinical, which made the facts land harder. The other lawyer tried to rattle her. She did not rattle. When he asked if she was certain about the browser history, she said, Yes, she had taken forensic images, and no, she could not share them outside of the court's order, and yes, she had already lodged copies with the clerk under seal. The judge nodded, satisfied. Then Coleman called me. I stood at the witness stand and placed my palm on the Bible and promised to tell the truth. I told you. I told the judge about the meeting in Coleman's conference room. I told him about the glasses of water and the 5-minute timer and the way Richard had smiled. I said the word poison once, carefully, without dramatics. I described how Detective Harris had taken my statement, how the hospital had called later that evening to say Richard was stable. I did not conjecture. I did not call names. I did not raise my voice. I made my sentences short on purpose so they would land before anyone could bend them. The other lawyer asked a few questions, mostly about my state of mind. "Were you angry," he asked, "when you learned your wife's will did not favor your daughter?" "I was relieved," I said. "It favored the living." He blinked as if the answer had moved the furniture in his head. "You mean charities," he said. "I mean the people those charities touch," I said. For a moment, the room grew very quiet. Even the HVAC hum seemed to step into the hall. When it was over, we waited. The judge took a recess to review the exhibits. I walked to the window and looked out at the square of sky the courthouse gave to people who came there. Blue, with a small white cloud that looked like a handkerchief folded in a pocket. Coleman stood beside me, not speaking, a steady presence. Linda sat in the back row, looking down at her phone and then up again, the way a person looks toward an exit that keeps moving. We returned to our seats when the bailiff called us back. The judge adjusted his glasses and lifted the original will. He held it like something both ordinary and sacred. "The court finds the will executed in Mr. Coleman's office to be valid," he said. "It meets all formal requirements, and the testimony is clear and convincing as to capacity. The latter document offered by respondents is not accepted. The irregularities are substantial, the notary lacks credibility, and the chain of custody is non-existent. Further, I am referring the matter of that document to the district attorney for review." A rustle went through the courtroom, the sound of 100 people remembering how to breathe. The judge continued, voice even. "The restraining order is made permanent pending distribution under the valid will. The charitable beneficiaries are recognized. The daughter's bequest is to be managed under the safeguards specified. Counsel, please prepare an order consistent with this ruling." I didn't move right away. I felt the words settle into the bones of the room, into the wood of the bench beneath my hand. The other lawyer's face went slack, then flushed. He started to stand, then sat. He turned to say something to Linda, but she was staring straight ahead, eyes bright and unfocused, as if she were watching the last 10 years roll backward and forward at once. Her mouth opened. No sound came out. Then her shoulders folded in, small and sharp, like a bird pulling its wings around itself on a cold wire. Outside, the winter sun had shifted, casting new angles across the courthouse steps. Coleman shook my hand and then put his hand on my shoulder. "You did what needed doing," he said, with a steady hand. I nodded. My voice took a moment to arrive. "Eleanor did what needed doing," I said. "She left the map. I just followed it." We walked a few steps in silence. I could feel the day expanding, making room for what came next. There would be paperwork. There would be distributions to set up. There would be hard conversations I could not avoid. There would be quiet evenings in my kitchen where the light would slant across the table and the safe would sit under the bed like a tired soldier off duty. But there would also be sleep, real sleep, the kind you get when something heavy lands where it belongs at last. Linda came down the steps behind us. She stopped on the third one and looked at me, and in that look I saw the little girl with the purple bicycle, and the teenager who slammed her bedroom door, and the grown woman who had chosen a man over her father. All of them? She did not come closer. She spoke quietly, as if we were in church, and she had something she needed to say before the hymn. "You made me look small in there," she said. I shook my head. "No," I said, and the words were gentle. Truth made the room the size it really was. Tears sprang into her eyes and dried without falling. She turned away. "You'll regret this," she said, but the sentence didn't have teeth. It landed on the step between us and slid away. I watched her go. I did not follow. I stood where I was and felt the wind lift the edge of my coat. I put my hand inside and touched the letter in my pocket, the paper warm from being near my heart. "Eleanor," I whispered, so quietly only the fabric heard me. "You left me a weapon. Now I've used it." I walked to the edge of the square and sat on a bench with a view of the courthouse doors. People came and went, lawyers in dark suits, couples holding hands. A man with a folder clutched to his chest like a shield. I watched them all and thought of the foundation that would be fed by Eleanor's choice, of the nurses whose schooling would be paid for, of the elderly who would get a check that arrived exactly when a scam had taken their last savings. I thought of the house on our street where the maple tree drops red leaves in October. I thought of morning light in my kitchen. I thought of sleep. I stood at last and headed toward the parking lot. The day felt different on my skin, lighter, honest. There would be more to do. There always is. But the shape of the future had changed, and it fit the truth better than the lie ever had. As I reached for the car door, I stopped and looked back at the courthouse one more time, at its columns and its glass, and the sky it framed. They thought I was weak. They thought age made me easy to move. They thought money could teach love how to bend. They were wrong. Justice is slow sometimes, but when it arrives, it speaks plainly. I got in, started the engine, and drove not home, not yet, but past the community center where the foundation's mailing address would soon be listed on every letter we sent. I imagined Eleanor's name on the plaque by the door. I imagined a Tuesday afternoon when a nurse would smile and sign her acceptance letter and think, somewhere out there, someone believed in me. At the light, I rolled down the window and let the cold air slice through the car. It felt clean. It felt like the first breath after a deep dive. I placed my hand on the envelope in my coat again, not because I needed to, but because it felt right to share one more minute with the woman who had made sure her voice would carry. When I reached my street, the maple in the front yard was bare. The house waited. It didn't look like a prize anymore. It looked like a home again, a place to put your hands on the counter and breathe. I parked, walked up the path, and stood on the porch with the key in my hand. For a long moment, I didn't move. I just stood and listened to the quiet. Then I unlocked the door and stepped inside. If there is one thing I know now, it's this. They believed I would step aside. They counted on it. Instead, I stepped forward, and the ground held. Empathy, CTA. Feeling unseen, dismissed, or blamed like that is a heavy weight, isn't it? If you believe every person deserves justice and to be truly seen, comment the keyword, justice. Now keep watching and see what they do next to change everything. If you're still watching and find this story interesting, please comment 3 below to let me know you're here with me. The morning after the judgment was entered, I drove back to the courthouse with Coleman to deliver the last of the paperwork. The envelope in my hand felt lighter than it had before, though the pages inside carried the weight of $12.5 million and the lives those dollars would touch. The clerk stamped each sheet, the red ink crisp in the corner, and just like that, the will Eleanor had written with her careful hand became more than just words on paper. It became law. It became the future. Most of our estate, the home, the investments, the insurance, was bound for the community foundation, for scholarships, for seniors who had been swindled, for nurses who needed help. A smaller portion would still go to Linda, set aside in a way Richard could never touch. I stood there, watching the stamps fall, and I whispered inside myself, "Eleanor, we did it. You did it." When I left the courthouse, I didn't drive back to the big house on Maple Street. That house had been a battlefield. Every photograph on the mantel felt like a witness to betrayal. Every creak of the floorboard sounded like a question I didn't want to answer. Instead, I met with a realtor who had been waiting for my call. Within weeks, the sign went up in the yard, white letters against green grass. For sale. $750,000. Offers came quickly from families who looked at the maple tree out front and saw autumn leaves, not arguments. By the end of the month, the house wasn't mine anymore. Strangely, I felt relief, not loss. I had carried it long enough. It was time to put it down. I found a smaller place across town, a modest 2-bedroom apartment overlooking a park. $200,000, clean and simple, with wide windows that let the morning light pour across the carpet. From my balcony, I could see children running with kites and older couples walking hand in hand. The first night I slept there, I kept the window open just a crack so I could hear the rustle of leaves. No voices arguing, no footsteps that didn't belong, just peace. I unpacked slowly, placing Eleanor's photograph on the bookshelf, the frame catching the sunlight in the afternoons. I read more. I joined a community book club at the library. Every Tuesday, I sat in a circle of strangers turned friends, sipping coffee and talking about novels. I hadn't realized how much I had missed simple conversations that didn't carry hidden knives. While my life moved toward calm, Richard's world collapsed. The district attorney pressed charges: fraud, forgery, attempted murder. The trial was swift. The evidence stacked higher than his lies could climb. The jury took only a few hours. 25 years, the judge said. Richard stood at the defense table, his hands clenching and unclenching, his face pale and tight. Linda sat in the back, watching her husband being led away in handcuffs, the chains rattling like punctuation. She didn't speak to me. She didn't look at me. She followed him with her eyes until the door closed. That was the last time I saw them together. After that, the phone calls stopped, and the family invitations dried up. Her cousins no longer called her. Old friends crossed the street when they saw her coming. Loyalty to Richard cost her more than money. It cost her belonging. And in the quiet spaces, I imagine she felt the weight of that. As for me, I felt lighter with each passing day. I spent mornings walking in the park. I bought a second-hand fishing rod and sat by the pond, casting my line and watching the ripples spread out. Some days I caught nothing, but I always came home with peace. In the evenings, I cooked small meals, simple dishes Eleanor and I used to make: chicken soup, cornbread, apple pie. I played old records while I cooked, letting the music fill the corners of my apartment. Sometimes I spoke out loud, as if Eleanor were still listening. "It tastes just like before," I would say, sliding the pie onto the counter. And in those moments, I felt her closer than ever. One afternoon, the phone rang. The voice on the other end was Linda's. For a moment, I thought she might apologize, might reach for a bridge she had burned. But her words were thin, brittle. "Dad, I just wanted to say, I didn't know it would turn out this way. People don't understand. They don't see what Richard meant to me." Her voice cracked. Then silence. I took a deep breath. My heart wanted to comfort her, to say what fathers are supposed to say. But I remembered Eleanor's words. "Protect yourself. Protect our work." I steadied my voice. "Linda," I said quietly, "respect is the foundation of family. Without it, blood is only water. I wish you peace, but I cannot walk back into that storm." There was another pause, and then the line went dead. I placed the phone on the table and felt no regret, only clarity, boundaries finally drawn. That night I sat on the balcony and watched the stars rise above the trees. The cool air brushed against my face, and for the first time in years, I realized I wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop. I whispered into the night, "I'm free now, not free from a house or from money, but free from betrayal." Saying it out loud gave the words weight. I leaned back in the chair and let them settle into me like a warm blanket. In the weeks that followed, I found myself smiling more often. At the cashier in the grocery store. The children are playing soccer in the field. An elderly man in the park played harmonica for the pigeons. Life felt lighter, as if betrayal had been a heavy coat I had finally shrugged off. I kept Eleanor's letter in my desk drawer, not because I needed to read it anymore, but because it reminded me of strength. Her words had guided me through fire, and now they guided me into peace. Meanwhile, Richard's name became a cautionary tale in the papers. His photograph appeared on the evening news, the anchor's voice steady as she spoke of his sentence. Linda's name was mentioned less, though whispers followed her wherever she went. She moved into a small apartment on the edge of town, I heard, far from the family home she had once tried to claim. Some said she still visited Richard, sitting across from him in the prison cafeteria, holding his hand through the glass. Others said she cried alone, wishing she had chosen differently. I didn't know which story was true, maybe both, but I no longer carried the burden of fixing it. That weight wasn't mine anymore. The lesson I carried was simple but carved deep. Blood may be thicker than water, but respect is the true foundation of family. Without respect, love curdles into control, and loyalty turns to chains. I had given Linda every chance, tuition, a wedding, a house. But she traded gratitude for greed, and in doing so, she broke the very bond she claimed to protect. I survived, not by clinging to her, but by holding to the truth that respect, honesty, and self-worth cannot be stolen or forged. They are earned, and they are chosen. As I sat with these thoughts, I realized something else. I no longer felt bitterness. The anger that once burned in me had cooled into something steadier. Self-respect. I wasn't just surviving betrayal. I was living beyond it. I had rebuilt, smaller and simpler, but stronger. I had proof now that life after betrayal wasn't just possible, it was rich. One morning, a letter arrived in my mailbox. The envelope was thick, with the city seal in the corner. Inside was an invitation. The Community Foundation, the same one Eleanor and I had poured so much into, was inviting me to join their board of trustees. They wanted me to help oversee the scholarships, the grants, the programs that would now carry Eleanor's name. I sat at my kitchen table, the paper spread out before me, and I smiled, a deep, genuine smile that reached all the way inside. Maybe it's time to begin a new chapter, I whispered. And for once, the future didn't feel like something to fear. It felt like something to welcome. I folded the letter carefully, set it on the counter, and poured myself a cup of coffee. Outside, the park was alive with the sounds of morning, laughter, footsteps, the bark of a dog chasing a stick. I opened the window wider, letting it all in. My story wasn't over. It was simply turning a page. The mornings in my new apartment became my favorite time of day. I would wake up with the soft light pouring through the wide windows, the sound of children laughing in the park drifting in with the breeze. The building was quiet, the walls fresh with paint, the kind of place where you could actually hear yourself think. I brewed a simple cup of coffee, set Eleanor's photo on the table in front of me, and watched the sun climb over the trees. For the first time in years, I didn't feel the knot in my chest. I didn't feel the weight of suspicion or betrayal pressing down on me. I felt something softer. Peace. Every morning I took a walk in the park. Some days I followed the winding path past the duck pond. Other days I sat on the bench under the big oak tree, the one that turned golden in the fall. The air smelled like grass and fresh rain. I watched couples hold hands, children kick soccer balls, and old men play chess. Nobody knew me here. Nobody cared what had happened in my family. That anonymity was healing. I wasn't the man with the daughter who betrayed him. I was just another neighbor with a book in his hand and a smile for the stranger passing by. That was enough. I joined the local community center. At first it was just for the book club, but soon I found myself volunteering. A friend introduced me to a group dedicated to helping seniors who had been victims of financial scams. I knew their pain. I had lived it from within my own family. I signed up without hesitation. Every Wednesday, I sat in the community hall, listening to stories that made my own heart ache. a retired teacher who lost her pension to a fraudulent investment scheme, a widower whose son convinced him to sign away his savings. Their voices shook with shame, but I saw myself in each of them. That's when I decided I wouldn't just listen, I would help. We started small. I donated part of what Eleanor and I had set aside. $200,000 went into a new program to provide legal aid for seniors. I stood there at the launch, the microphone in my hand, and I said, "Greed took my family from me, but it won't take my dignity, and it won't take yours either." The room clapped, not because they knew my story in detail, but because they knew what betrayal felt like. For the first time, I felt my pain transform into purpose. Meanwhile, Richard's fate took its course behind bars. News came through whispers in the family and from the paper. His health declined. The arrogance drained from him. Prison walls don't let you pretend for long. He was just another inmate, stripped of his suits and his smooth talk, left with nothing but time to face himself. 25 years. It might as well have been a lifetime. Linda, on the other hand, sent me a letter. The envelope arrived with her handwriting, shaky, like she wasn't sure whether to write it at all. Inside, her words spilled with apology. She wrote about regret, about feeling blind, about not knowing how she could have chosen so wrong. I sat with that letter in my hands for a long time. My fingers traced the lines, but my heart stayed still. I whispered, "I don't need their apology. I have my life." And then I folded the letter, slid it into a drawer, and never wrote back. That boundary mattered more than any apology could. The contrast was stark. Richard, rotting in a cell. Linda, isolated, living with choices that burned her bridges. And me, walking in the park, cooking in my small kitchen, laughing with new friends at the community center. I was free in ways they could never understand. I began keeping a small notebook, not for money or accounts, but for reflections. In it, I wrote the lessons I wished I had known earlier, the ones I hoped others would carry. For parents, never hand over everything to your children until you are certain they understand gratitude. Love is not blind. Protect what you've worked for, even from those you love, because protection is part of love. For children, don't let greed burn the bridges your parents built with their hands and hearts. Money can be earned again, but trust once broken is a wound that never fully heals. And about people in this modern world, ambition and hunger can twist even the purest bonds, turning family into adversaries. It is not wealth that poisons us, but the willingness to trade our character for it. One quiet afternoon, while sorting through old boxes, I found a small watch. It was my father's, scratched on the edges, the leather band worn smooth from years on his wrist. I had nearly forgotten I still had it. When I wound it, the tick-tick-tick filled the room. I smiled. That watch had survived wars, recessions, and hardships. It was a reminder that time doesn't bend for anyone, and it reminded me of something else. Character is the one inheritance no one can steal. That was the lesson my father lived, and now it was mine to carry forward. Life became simple, and in that simplicity, it became beautiful again. I spent afternoons tending to a small row of potted plants on my balcony. The neighbors would wave, and I'd wave back. Some evenings I hosted a few people from the community center for coffee and pie, and we'd laugh until our sides ached. There was no weight of suspicion in those gatherings, no agendas, just a connection. I found myself whispering late at night, "I finally found where I belong." The story of betrayal that once consumed me had now folded itself into something else, a story of boundaries, respect, and survival. Richard and Linda became shadows in my rearview mirror, reminders of roads not to travel again. I didn't hate them anymore. Hate is too heavy. I simply refused to let them back into my circle. My circle was for peace, for honesty, for people who knew the worth of trust. When I looked back at everything that had happened, the betrayal, the courtroom battles, the prison sentence, the isolation, I realized something. It all led me here. To this small apartment worth $200,000, looking over a park full of laughter. To this chair where I sat with Eleanor's picture beside me. To the community that welcomed me not for my wealth, but for my presence. To the certainty that my worth was never in the money, but in the choices I made when everything was on the line. And so I leave my story with this reflection. Family is not just blood. Family is respect. Parents, protect yourselves with wisdom as much as with love. Children, honor the hands that raised you more than the wealth they might leave behind. And for us all, remember this truth in a world so quick to measure worth in dollars. Character is the one inheritance no one can steal. The story has come to an end. I hope it has brought you valuable lessons and insights. If you enjoyed this content, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next video. Goodbye, and see you again.